Hello everyone, my name is Mиляны Радивоевич and I am the lecturer in Archaeomaterials at the UCL Institute of Archaeology in London. I am very privileged to be part of this conference, the Cultural Heritage of Uzbekistan in the World Collections, and I'm honored for the invitation by the chairman, Mr. Firdaus Abdulkhalikov, of the World Society for the Study, Preservation and Popularization of the Cultural Legacy of Uzbekistan. Today I'm going to talk about an aspect of research that I've been working on for a few years that still hasn't got finite results and that I'm hoping to continue together with the Cultural Heritage of Uzbekistan in the World Collections project. It is about the making of the Silk Roads, or how metallurgy can reveal some of the aspects of how Central Asia participated in the making of the Silk Roads between, as you see, like a very large chronological span, 3500 BC to around 1220s, so just before the Mongol invasion. So when we think about the Silk Roads, we usually think about these historical Silk Roads that start around the 300 BC during the Han Dynasty China and spread throughout all these big urban centers of the agrarian empires of the outer Eurasia. And we know that the drill of the camel caravans, the trade of spices, the trade of carpets, and so on. But we rarely know about other archaeological evidence that goes beyond 300 BC about what makes the Silk Roads. So the oldest Silk Roads evidence dated back to 4500 BC, which is shown in a burial in the site of Begash in Kazakhstan with a project of Americans from the Washington University in St. Louis and my colleague Michael Fraschetti. So what they found is that there were ancient connections across Inner Asia reflected in the meeting of the domestic millet and domestic wheat. So what does it mean? It means that the wheat must have come from Southwest Asia and the millet must have come from East Asia, from China. And this is basically the point of the meeting, which is what Silk Roads is at the end of the day. So obviously it spun many interesting stories in the media outlets. People hailed it, this research, and others as well as the kind of the grain road, if you like, not only the Silk Roads. But I'm really hopeful that I can insert the metal roads or the bronze roads, if you like, and convince you that it may have been one of the kind of most spectacular networks of connections across Eurasia in history. So what do I mean when I talk about networks of connections in the Bronze Age? You will see on this map that the kind of outline area is the area where the bronze artifacts were traded far and wide between the coasts of Atlantic and Pacific. So everything from Britain to China and in between. And the interesting point about these trade and exchange networks is that they were all desiring the same type of tools. The shaft hole axes, the celts, the halberds, spearheads. So kind of weapons more than tools, I would say, but they were all made of bronzes. And the interesting aspect about making a bronze, for those who do not know, is that the bronzes are made with the alloy of copper and tin. And tin resources are quite scarce. You will see them as these yellow stars on the map. So the most prolific tin resources exploited in antiquity were in the Altai Mountains in Central Asia, in Cornwall in Britain, and in Germany, Austria and Germany. So what is very interesting about this is that because these sources were very scarce, you could imagine that people controlling, communities controlling those resources had a very important role in organizing logistics, production, but also controlling the circulation of metals. However, we see that most of these metals do end up in the agrarian empires, which are the red hatch fields on the map, where we have the Shang Dynasty China, so mid-2nd millennium BC, the Indus Valley Civilization, Mesopotamia, Mediterranean, Egypt, all urban centers as we know them. But look at the vast space just around these agrarian empires that was all populated by so-called barbarians, as people like to call them, scholars like to call them in historical interpretations. But they were far away from being barbarians, especially because now we learn that they actually were actively participating in building these societies in outer Eurasia. So what is happening in Europe at the time, just to kind of present the comparative analysis during this time, mid-2nd millennium BC, is that there is a transitioning from local sources exploitation to regional centers or mining complexes. And all these red dots that you see on the map are actually mining sites. So I'll take, for example, two. One of them in Wales had the peak during this kind of a big bronzization period, but most of the copper that was produced was just less than a ton, estimated through the investigation of the shafts and the mining complex as such. In Mitterberg in Austria, during the same period, we have, if you see, a total of say 10,600 metric tons in the period, which is kind of the boom period, or just thereabout. But that's it when it comes to Europe, and this is kind of the biggest mining complex we have in the Bronze Age. But in Kargali, in Russia, in southern Urals, we have at the same time, within the same time frame, the activities for mining that were spanning across 35,000 shafts, 500 square kilometers, several hundreds of kilometers of underground galleries, and all amounting to around 150,000 metric tons. So it's like 15 times more than the most prolific mining complex in Europe, only to show you the scale of these activities and the participation of these societies that we like to call barbarians, but were actually very savvy nomads, or rather pastoralist societies at the time. So yes, we tend to think about societies occupying the steppes largely and spaces of Central Eurasia, if you like, as these goat herders, horse chasers, chariot riders, and rarely do we see them as actually being the major agents of supplying the urban centers of the old world, as I mentioned, the Shang Dynasty, Indus civilization, societies in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mediterranean, and because all of these resources were actually in Central Eurasia and across the Eurasian steppes, we can actually say that these inner Asian societies were directly feeding the emerging political leadership of these complex societies, as I mentioned them, living at the outskirts of these Central Eurasian spaces, and fueling the most important global economic network at the time, which later are going to be called the Silk Roads, all these pathways. But at the time, I believe, because of the scope of the metals being traded, they could be called the Bronze Road. These networks, the pathways of interaction. So the key to how and why is a trust in technology, organization, interconnectivity. And why technology is because the survival rate of metal artifacts is far, far greater than the survival rate of any skeletal material, any organic residues, and similar. And there we have the big story in the making just by analyzing metals. Just fast forward to the 9th century AD. We have also a very exquisite and remarkable production of steel along the Silk Roads, where several production centers were located in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and India. We are still not certain where are all these recipes coming from, but they do differ between themselves, and there is scope for more investigation to look at how is this famous steel being produced, because that steel has been used for forging one of the most precious commodities, weapons commodities, along the historical Silk Road, the Damascus steel, for making the swords that were famous for cutting a silk into, or a thread of hair into, and being able to bend without breaking, and overall the most superior weapon that definitely gave power to the military at the time, and was definitely contributing to the huge success that societies, communities, and empires of the Silk Roads had at the time. So why are metals important? Technology of making tells us about the knowledge, innovation, and transmission processes. Chemical composition tells us about the sources of metal being used and how do they travel. And networks of interaction tell us about who's liking whom, who's talking to whom, and tell us about the human behavior. And metals are the most abundant debris, as I've mentioned, as opposed to anything else, and therefore can be used to reconstruct the life of past societies that was not only revolving around the metals, but reflected in the interaction with metals, and many other aspects of lives, such as looking at the deep history of certain events, or looking at the transmission of knowledge, transmission of ideas, origins of ideas, and so on. And just to kind of give I put this picture up just to show that indeed metals can tell us a lot about the lives of societies beyond just the metals trade, about the literacy, about the migration, about the types of commodities being traded, about the aspirations of big leaders, about the building of the monumental architecture as we know it. So we have a big story to tell just by studying metals, technological behavior, transmission of knowledge, and how societies at the time using these tools to achieve their goals. So there are 3 projects in the making. One is obviously tracing of the Bronze Road, the other one is steel for the Silk Roads, and the third one is following the footsteps of the last Timurids, which is related to the steel project, but is more focused on the cultural heritage aspect of it. So for the Bronze Road, the idea is to build this database for provenance in the earliest copper and bronzes of the prehistoric Silk Roads, with the main partners besides UCL, the Uzbek Academy of Sciences, and Navoy State Mining Institute. I've been studying metallurgy around Central Asia for a while, mostly in Kazakhstan to begin with. I just show you here the tools, how do they look like. Some of them are weapons, some of them are tools. And these areas that you see on the map are actually areas where all these artifacts come from that I study, and some of the sites. And by using the provenance analysis, I could see that none of these metals that were circulating Kazakhstan were actually coming from Kazakhstani resources, but rather some of them are located in China, the border actually with East Kazakhstan and China, and one of them in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and a certain aspect of the provenance indicated also Northwest Indian resources. And when we try to think about why these mountain deposits were being used, well, we can see a certain pathway, a certain pattern taking place there. They're all along the Inner Asia mountain corridor that was making a very strong part of the connectedness, actually connecting the Silk Roads in between the Eastern Eurasia and Southwest Asia, and obviously feeding that metal into Kazakhstan at the time. We know also that the tin resources were located along these routes, so it all kind of starts making more sense and coming together. The area that I'm particularly interested in is furthering research in Uzbekistan, because we have seen that many of these artifacts actually come from these fallow-rich deposits which exist in Uzbekistan but nowhere in Kazakhstan. So when it comes to silk for the Silk Roads, for steel for the Silk Roads, we have partners besides UCL in Institute for Archaeometallurgical Studies, Uzbek Academy of Sciences, and the Cyprus Institute in Cyprus. I don't need to tell you much about Axikent. I trust this is your national treasure. It's a humongous site with huge importance, historically speaking, when it comes to that being home of Babur, the last Timurid, and the home of the first, the founder of the Mughal Empire. And also this center, this site is very famous for the crucible steel production that has been studied in detail, and that we plan to further a little bit more and look at the aspects of steel production and the spatial distribution and reconstructing the bazaar and so on, and also looking at the surrounding centers to see how far was this knowledge replicated. Speaking about following the footsteps of the last Timurids, there is a big planning of the virtual tour through Axikent in the Fergana Valley with partners from Bournemouth University and Uzbek Academy of Sciences. So that includes detailed area mapping, 3D landscape modeling of the site. Then we can also use that to represent artifacts or inside spaces with a very high resolution and low-cost equipment. But the added value to all of this is that we will provide training for the young scholars and the interested youth in this kind of analysis and presentation, which is one of the goals of your conference. And I'm really happy to report that we may be taking big steps towards this plan from spring next year, inshallah. So speaking of the virtual reality, again, there is a possibility to reconstruct the walls, see how that could have looked like in the past and present it to the wider audience. The most exciting actually part of the virtual tour is the 3D reconstruction, the virtual tour and virtual reconstruction for those who would kind of walk through the site. And we plan for that to reconstruct a few events, such as the buzzing of the bazaar, the production of the steel, even maybe Babur's father walking along those walls of Axikent. So technology, organization, and connectedness do offer a lesson for the future, and I'm really hopeful that in these small steps we make one huge step for the Uzbek cultural heritage in recognizing its value and popularizing it globally even further. So what is interesting to think about these days is that how is it relevant today, apart from furthering our knowledge? Well, thinking about the Bronze Age sites that I presented, some of them are located along the historical Silk Roads, but most of them are actually sitting on these new Silk Roads, but not so new Silk Roads. It's a new initiative coming from China about the Belt and Road Initiative for building the infrastructure to connect Eurasia between the coasts of Atlantic and Pacific. But the idea is not new. The idea is old, and the idea comes from the Bronze Age, when societies were equally connected throughout same routes and same pathways some 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, in order to understand how to navigate and balance our differences and how to strive towards the, if you like, togetherness and building a bigger community, not only Central Asia, but Central Eurasia and beyond. Archaeology and history are very important part of that process. So I'm remaining hopeful that I left some food for the thought, which is that the many of the greatest challenges of facing humanity in the future will not be technological, but social and cultural. And this is why social sciences matter. Because we are living in the data where we have big data, large-scale humanities, infrastructures, and digital heritage available. And the grain, the bronze of the Silk Roads are the first and the largest economic network in Eurasia, which are unrivaled continent, which are unrivaled in its size and population, and it's the largest continent, and therefore offers a perfect case study to test how far we can go in building a stronger community and strongly interconnected societies, because these issues will continue to emerge as formative for every new economic project or era. Now we have the Belt and Road Initiative, but many others will come, hopefully. But it's very important to understand that it's just part of this longue durée perspective, longue durée process that lasts for several thousands of years, and we will be better off understanding how it started, how it's going, and where is it going. Thank you very much.